Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
History is written by dominant voices. 200 years later, maybe there's a new political ideology. And that looks at that marginalized figure, brings that up as a totemic sort of emblem of their movement. So Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra, this generation is constantly interpreting, reinterpreting, and he is a motif and a symbol for many.
Nowadays, there's a rhetoric for a Hindu Rashtra, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. If we start applying a national agenda to a religion,
faith is a very personal thing. Religious identity, on the other hand, has always been fairly political. Political identities want homogeneity because that's how you unite people. You create a solid block that is able to stand up against the other. In creating that, we also flatten out a lot of the inner diversity. Jawaharlal Nehru, right? In his writings, it's all wonderful, freedom of expression. In power, he had to make certain compromises. It's always easier to be a poet when you're just a poet. To put the poet on a throne, the British were the colonizers and we were the ones who were colonized. My problem is when we flatten that into, oh my God, they were these like all-powerful oppressors and we were these like passive, suffering people.
This is the conversation with Manu Pillai. He is an award-winning historian, the author of multiple bestsellers like The Ivory Throne, Gods, Guns and Missionaries, Rebel Sultans, and False Allies. He has formerly served as the Chief of Staff for Shashi Tharoor and is consistently one of the leading historians in India today. In this conversation, we explore what is the role of history, what is the importance, what role does it play in an individual's life and in making society move forward. We explore how and why he fell in love with history. We also explore the history of the marginalized, the story of Sethu Lakshmibai or the Sultans of the Deccan. Who actually writes history? Is it great individuals or is it these larger Marxist forces? Or is it, interestingly, the people who are often erased who come back and end up reclaiming history? We also study the origins of a religion. How does it evolve over time? The origins of Hindu nationalism, the pros and cons of it. And then we also explore the psychology of power, defiance, and the role of women in history. I live and die for these conversations. I'm a geek for these 2-hour conversations about history, about sociology, about psychology. But while I'm a fan of these conversations, the YouTube algorithm is not a fan. It prefers 60-second dance videos. So if you like this conversation, by the end of this episode, please consider sharing it around so I can break past these barriers that have been set by the algorithm and I can have more conversations like these. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's no time.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
I want to start with a little game segment. I'm going to give you a picture of a painting. And I would love it if you can give me an express TED talk on that painting. Assume you're teaching this painting as a case study in a classroom. So this is the painting. And I would like to know who's in the painting, what's being depicted, what are the symbolism, motifs, and what does that tell me about those times?
Very conveniently, this is a picture from one of my books. So this isn't very difficult as a task. So the thing is, when we talk about history, it isn't just the records and the files and the paperwork that exists, or even the inscriptions and the monuments. There is a lot of art that can guide how you understand the past, because people in the past, just as we today on Instagram, we're constantly, with every picture we post, we're sort of self-fashioning. We're creating an impression of ourselves that is idealized and that is for the world. Even when we put up candid pictures, we think about it. We're like, this candid picture I'll put. We're not going to put up pictures of us digging our nose, right? There's always going to be, there's a degree of performance involved in images. And historically also, historical figures understood the fact that images tend to be something that can really communicate powerful ideas and have meaning. So this image is from one of my books called False Allies. And on the face of it, it's a married couple. It's the Maharaja of Mysore in the early 1900s with his wife. It's done by Raja Ravi Verma, who was the go-to art portrait maker at the time, very fashionable society painter. She's dressed, the Maharaja's wife is dressed in the typical Mysore silk sari, etc. And this later became a print. It was very popular during the Maharaja's reign. People would hang it in their houses, etc. But there is a bigger story that this image is telling. For example, on the one hand, this awkwardness between them, you can think of it as an arranged marriage situation where the couple have just practically met and that's the source of the awkwardness. But more importantly, it also tells a story about caste and dynastic aspirations, because the Mysore royal family were Vadiyars from South India in Karnataka. This lady actually isn't Kannadiga. She's actually a Rajput woman from Gujarat. And that's the story the painting really tells, which is, at least from a historian's perspective, by the late 19th century, the Mysore Maharajas, even though they were a South Indian dynasty, etc., typically they used to marry local women from local communities and caste groups. But by the late 19th century, they had a desire to acquire brides from a pan-Indian sort of stage, and especially from Rajput families, because they started fashioning themselves as Rajputs who happened to have migrated to South India at a certain point. It's a bit of myth-making. All dynasties do that. They always claim glorious origins, etc. And therefore, the royal family is very keen to start acquiring Rajput brides. Mm-hmm. The problem was that when they first sent emissaries to North India, to Rajputana, Udaipur, Kota, Rewa, all of those families, the major Rajput states, the Rajputs said, actually, we don't recognize you as Rajputs. You're South Indians. We don't see you as equals. Even though Mysore was politically superior, it was a wealthy state, etc., the Rajputs, at a caste level and in terms of acknowledging the Mysore family as gold standard Kshatriyas, the Rajputs were not keen. But because the Maharaja's mother was very keen that he must have a Rajput bride, eventually the quest led them to Gujarat, because Gujarat also has the Saurashtra Rajputs. And there they found one particular Rajput prince who was willing to give them his daughter. Now the difference is Mysore was a 21-gun salute state, which is the topmost category of Indian princely states. It was one of the wealthiest states in India. It was one of the most prestigious gaddis or thrones to hold. And this lady's father actually came from a microscopic territory in Saurashtra. I think they had 3,000 subjects, only a few tens of thousands of rupees in revenue, practically non-entities, not major princes at all. But because the Mysore family was so anxious for Rajput blood, they forgot about the fact that, forget that this woman's kingdom is tiny, that it's not equal status politically, they just wanted that Rajput blood. And for that reason, the Rana of Vana's daughter ended up coming to Mysore and marrying the Maharaja. There was all kinds of complications involved. People here didn't like it because they said, this is a foreigner, she's not local, she doesn't speak Kannada. How are how the couple going to live? Because he's a vegetarian, she's a non-vegetarian. He speaks Kannada, she speaks another language. So there were all of these complications. And again, in marriages like this, these were never just private affairs. As I said, the marriage itself was political, dynastic, etc. In other princely states, we actually have cases where even when the marriage was consummated, so in Travancore, when the Maharani and her husband would sleep together was decided by astrologers and the court. So you had no sense of privacy. It wasn't like, oh, I'm feeling it today and I'm going to go into my wife's bedroom. No. The astrologer will tell you such and such muhurtam is good for conceiving an heir to the throne, and this is when you will go to your wife's bedchamber. So there was a rule and there were rules and protocols around it. In this case, even the British got involved because apparently who was the viceroy then? Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon's private papers, you actually find letters where he's getting complaints from the court of Mysore saying the Maharaja refuses to see his wife. After a year, they've still not consummated the marriage. She's in tears and she's suicidal, etc. And for all practical purposes, the marriage doesn't yield any benefits in that she ends up living in a different palace, he ends up living somewhere else, and they don't have children. Which is why this painting is also in many ways ironic, because this lady was imported from Gujarat to bring Rajput blood into the Wadiyar dynasty's veins, except that there were no children, and therefore the next Wadiyar was also the Maharaja's brother's child, who was again local. I think he also married a Rajput lady, but that marriage didn't last either. And again, his children were also born from a local lady. And it's only in the 21st century, actually, that the heir of the Mysore family ended up marrying a Rajput princess. And finally, in the 2020s or whatever, they've got Rajput blood in their veins. So in many ways, this painting reflects a 100-year aspiration of sorts for a South Indian dynasty to acquire Rajput status and Rajput blood in their veins.
One of the highlights of my life has been spending many afternoons at the Met, where typically if I would walk, or even the MoMA, I would walk past a painting, it would look good. But then when I went on a guided tour of it, the tour guide spent 15 minutes talking about the painting, and suddenly there's like new layers and textures that unveil themselves, just like what you've done with this painting. I love this kind of stuff.
Images are always very interesting for that reason. Even photographs, right? The most iconic picture of the Great Depression is that picture. It was taken by I forget the lady's name, but there's this very talented photographer. It's of a mother, and she's got an infant, I think, in her arm, and then she's got two kids facing with their backs to the camera, and she's looking out into the distance. Her face has lines on it, and that became the iconic image of the Great Depression. The suffering of a white mother and her children in rural America. Except that also has lots of layers. Firstly, that woman took multiple shots. She wasn't terribly happy with many of them. This was the final winning shot, as it were. This is the one that she really liked in the end. More importantly, I don't think the lady in it was white as such either. I think she was of indigenous American descent. So there's again lots of layers there, which in the name of the picture when it was printed, I think was called Migrant Mother. And it was assumed to be a representation of what white America was suffering during the Great Depression in the 1930s. But in reality, it was actually an indigenous woman who just happened to be here, and this photographer came and found her, etc. There's a lot of politics around this as well. Who takes the picture? How are they positioning these people? During the colonial period, a lot of the images that were made were genuinely and deliberately framed in a way to make Indians look exotic, to make us look different, etc., etc. To which Indians also sometimes countered it in interesting ways. There was a Maharaja of Jaipur called Ram Singh, and he was a great photographer as well. And he did a whole series of portraits of women in his harem. Now, the harem is not a space where the British have access. So the British and the colonial state always presented the harem as this very sensual place where people were sort of perfumed and lying about in silks and constantly plotting and sexually deprived or sexually debauched. Like these were the two extremes.
Degenerate part of society.
Very degenerate part of Indian society. An emblem of everything that was wrong with princely society. But if you look at Ram Singh's pictures of the women in the harem, he's posed them in almost assertive sort of ways. There's a sense of agency in the way these women are standing, posing, looking at the camera, etc. And of course, what I liked most is after I wrote an essay on it once, a friend of mine sent me a picture on WhatsApp saying, "Do you recognize this image?" And I was like, "Oh no, I don't recognize this one." Because apparently Ram Singh also took a few naughty pictures that can only be described as pornographic. So again, gives you a full spectrum of the Maharaja's mind, etc. So images do tell their stories, and it isn't just what you see at a glance. There's a lot to unpack in artworks, in photographs, etc., etc. Even in recent times, when Trump was shot at, and there's that picture, right, of him holding his hand up and all of that. That picture symbolized a lot of things at that moment in America. That picture captures an entire series of political, social, cultural trends, and an actual event, of course, but also conveys something else that's happening in America at a broader level. So I think images are a very powerful medium, including for historians.
I love it, the dialogue that you can have with a painting. Hopefully we're going to explore a lot of this as we chug along. But yeah, fantastic. And it's always something I find fascinating, how many layers you can reveal from just one picture. Before we talk about all of that, I want to talk about a story that you might know very well, which is your own personal story, your own history. You were a self-professed hyperactive kid when you were 8 years old. You've tried to jump out of a balcony once, as we all do. You once tried to set fire to your father's stack of corrected papers, once again, as we all do. So in a last-ditch effort, your sister gave you a book just to put you in one place, and you've said that changed everything. So take me back to those afternoons when you spent so many afternoons reading Tinkle, Archie's, Balram, Jane Austen, Enid Blyton, later on the works of Pula Deshpande. What was it about the world of books, about reading, about stories that finally put this hyperactive kid in one place, got him to stop jumping off balconies and setting things on fire?
The balcony thing, I was really young. I don't know, must have been 2 years old or something. The fire incident was when I was 5 or 6, and I was just playing with fire. And my father, he was a professor. So
as we all do, right?
There was a stack of papers sitting somewhere there, and I think I set fire to a ball of cotton or something, and was accidentally chucked it in the wrong direction, and it went and the whole thing caught fire. And there's a funny postscript to that story. Then I ran to the kitchen to fetch water. And for some reason, there was a glass with an empty hole at the bottom. I think it actually wasn't a glass. It's something my mother used in the oven when baking or whatever. And for some reason, I tried to get water in that, cupping it under my palm and all that. Complete idiot child. But yeah, I think books did settle the hyperactivity to a certain level, because in some ways, they still kept me engaged, but engaged in the head. I didn't necessarily need to physically move around. It was still engrossing me and engrossing all of my energies in a way that my attention was fully captured. I suppose this is what today, parents do with kids and screens, right? When kids are being difficult, you thrust a screen into their hands. In my time, it was another way. It was just that you thrust an interesting comic or you thrust an interesting book into the kids' hands, and it actually worked in my case, and I really enjoyed it. I think by my teens, I also enjoyed writing. So, I was already quite happy, therefore, getting into the world of literature and reading, etc. It became a very natural part of life. I grew up in Pune, and every summer we'd come to Kerala to my grandparents' place. And that was a 2-day train journey, I think. And that train journey is also full of books, because we would read and read and read and reread a lot of old comics, etc. Then we'd get to Kerala for 2 months of summer vacations, hot afternoons, lots of mangoes, lots of things. And then in the middle of that, of course, a lot of books as well. So it grew naturally. It became a very natural part of life. everything from Harry Potter to non-fiction books. I remember reading Shashi Tharoor in my teens. I didn't realize at that time I'd end up working with him. But, in those days, when you're trying to understand your country, etc., he'd written a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium. I found that really illustrative at that time. There's a book by Sunil Khilnani called The Idea of India, which again, in my teens I read, and I really found that very eye-opening and impressive. Ram Guha's India After Gandhi, that was again one of those books where for a teenager, it really gives you a broad picture of the world around you. And so slowly from fiction, I started reading more and more non-fiction, biographies and history and things like that. And then, it took a life of its own.
Yeah, during your teenage years, you started gravitating towards these books about nation building because you've said in the past that you started hitting this existential crisis in your teenage years, especially when you heard stories about your grandfather from your grandmother, because there was clearly a stark contrast between the life he was living as a teenager compared to the life that you were living as a teenager. There was this delta that you couldn't explain. And then you said you started spiraling even further and started asking these questions. Who am I? What is my place in society? How did I get here? And you said the only way to get the answers, it seemed like history was the only way to get the answers.
I mean, you make it sound a lot more philosophical and, I know, as if I'm sitting and reflecting and introspecting. I wasn't. I suppose at some level it takes a degree of vanity to think that, you matter so much in the world that you must find meaning for yourself. But I mean, there's some of that, which is that, I connected a lot to the stories of my ancestors, immediate family members, what were their journeys like. I found it fascinating, for example, that, in my paternal grandfather's time, they didn't have toilets. Everybody went outside. Whether you were a landlord or a peasant, everybody went outside. Open defecation was the norm in Kerala in the 1920s and 30s. And I just found that preposterous, but at the same time, fascinating. So it wasn't really great and glorious things that interested me. It was these everyday nitty-gritties of life. Even now, for example, when I hear about how families lived and how they organized their domestic life, one of the ways, we talked about paintings, right? Architecture also tells you a lot about societies and families and changing social mores. So back in the day in an agrarian society, it wasn't like everybody had a bedroom to themselves. It was communal living. Often the women and children slept in one part of the house, the men slept in another part of the house, bachelors had one part, so on and so forth. The head of the family had a specific bed, nobody would sit on it. There was an arrangement to these houses. And as I came into my teens, I kept wondering, how on earth did my great-grandparents produce 8 children? Because she and the children were always in one segment of the house. My great-grandfather was in another part of the house. They didn't share a bedroom. To the extent that apparently in old age, when they were asked to sleep in the same room, my great-grandmother found that deeply offensive and embarrassing. She's like, what will people say if I sleep in the same room as my husband? It's not a good thing. And I kept thinking, how on earth were they managing so many children? I mean, where was the actual act happening? It wasn't because I was prying on my great-grandparents' sex life. It was just out of curiosity. That is, in a household and in a social arrangement of this nature, what was people's intimacy like? What were their inner worlds like? What was their private life like? I remember being told that it was considered bad form for women to scream when they were giving birth. You were not supposed to scream. You had to be very ladylike and proper about it. Okay. And it's like, that sounds very difficult when you're, midway of squeezing a human being out of your system. So all of these questions really started interesting me in the past. It wasn't the kind of, you make it sound very self-reflective and as if I was sitting on some high pedestal and thinking about the big questions of the world. Some of that was there, but often it was also about these small questions, because I think that also illustrates life with greater texture, and it illustrates the past with greater texture and character.
With hindsight, it was that self-reflective, philosophical meandering. Maybe at that age, you didn't have the words to describe it. But I'm glad you were able to find that link between history and the answer to these questions. On the use and abuse of history in life, Nietzsche started by quoting Goethe, and he said, "Incidentally, I despise everything which merely instructs me without increasing or immediately enlivening my activity." When I was in high school, I could never see the link between history and my own life. The way it was taught in school was so passive, so detached. You had a list of kings, the years of reign, you memorized 5 points about their policies of reform, and I could never find any practical application of history. I could never see what the link with my life was. So just expanding on what you've just built, what is the use, what is the function, what is the role of history? One, in an individual's life, how can we use it to answer these existential questions that you faced? And then one step higher, how can you use history to even build a nation, build a society, make it move forward?
At one level, now at a philosophical level, I believe not everything needs to be useful in life. In the sense that we live in a technocratic world where it's assumed that for anything to have value, it must have a very definite use. But frankly, human life is more complicated than that. There are lots of things that don't necessarily have use. For example, art. Art is a form of self-expression, but it's not necessarily useful in a utilitarian sense, right? But it has a greater meaning. And human society would be dull if we didn't have art and color and texture. Anyway, but answering your question as to why history matters, I think just look around us, right? We're recording this in Bangalore. Everything, and this is an example I often give, which is that everything from the traffic woes of this city to why the city has so many parks, why and how the city developed, its cosmopolitan character, all of these things have their roots in history. You can't make sense of the present of this place even unless you understand how that place evolved and developed. When I'm looking at you, the way you've got a watch around your wrist, the t-shirt you're wearing, the hairstyle you and I have, the fact that we're wearing trousers, the fact that we're wearing shoes of a certain type, all of our choices also are essentially, they've passed through a historical process and made themselves relevant to us. That is why we're dressed in this way. That is why we're speaking this language as opposed to another language. That is why we're sitting with this kind of technology. All of this is answered by history. The devices we're using, the way we self-present, the clothes we wear, the way we arrange our hair, everything is ultimately a consequence of history. You're from up North India, so 100 years ago, you and I would have looked very different if we were having this conversation. I would have had long hair tied up on the side in something called a kudumi. I would be wearing a munda wrapped around my waist and probably no shirt. That is how I would have been dressed back in the day. I'd probably still have earrings because we used to wear kadukans in my part of Kerala. You, on the other hand, would be probably wearing a dhoti, which would be pulled from that way and then tucked at the back, etc. So, a different style of wearing the same fabric. You would have a different kind of hairstyle. Our caste backgrounds would determine exactly how we looked, exactly how our hair was tied, exactly how, what all we were allowed to wear, what all kind of jewelry we were allowed to wear. Even our appearance is in many ways a product of history. The fact that today you can be dressed like this and I could find an exact parallel to you in Hong Kong, I could find an exact parallel to you in New York, is because the world has standardized, is because of globalization, is because of these trends that have made the world smaller in some ways. All of that is also a product of history. So history isn't something that exists in some other planet. It is constantly around us. Everything about our present is a product of history.
Let's start our History 101 masterclass. I definitely want to explore this risk of standardizing, homogenizing, but we'll get to it after we build some of the context. Every time you've written a book, you've appeared on multiple panels, interviews, and you have provided an in-depth exploration of the content of that book. So today what I want to do is, in fact, take a macroscopic view of all your work and explore some of the patterns or the links that connect a lot of your work, and also how you look back on some of your older work now as you've developed as a writer as well. So we're going to take a top-down view and not just explore one book, but in fact explore how these different books from different eras, different people all tie together.
It sounds like a 10-year report card. It's been 10 years since I've been publishing, so you're making it sound
like
a 10-year
performance review.
Perfect. Let's do
this. We're going
this.
to have a report card. Let's see if you get A+ and all of it. The first pattern that I want to explore, which connects a lot of your work, is who actually writes history. Chinua Achebe had once said, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And there's this popular maxim, history is always written by the victors, written off the survivors. But is it actually? Because your work is damning evidence that, in fact, people who are forgotten or even try to be erased from history, they often get a bit of the spotlight. You've written about Sethu Lakshmibai, who you said was reduced to a footnote in history, reduced to irrelevance. You've covered some of the Deccan sultans and rebel sultans. You said marginalized in history. You talk about people like Madhu Pillai, work has been banned. Or you talk about Kunza Humayun Begum, who was actively, people try to erase her from history. So is it true? Is history always written about the survivors, or the people who are forgotten, when they finally do get the spotlight, they get a much larger real estate because they were forgotten earlier?
This whole history is written by the victors is a bit of a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, which is that it is greatly true, which is that history is written by dominant voices. Firstly, history in a country like India is written by people who can write, right? I mean, in a caste-based society where for the longest time, the bulk of our society was illiterate, even the people who recorded history or historical consciousness in records, in writing, were a certain segment of society. It wasn't everybody in society. Other people were recording themselves through song, through lore, and often through myth. In the sense that when you have to transmit history, not in writing, but you want to transmit something, but you don't have written resources, or the resources don't last, and you need to condense it into song, etc. It often gets mixed up in myth and legend and all of that, and that's how it gets packaged as a story and then disseminated to subsequent generations. So what happens is you inevitably see a caste system of sources as well. And often historians fall into that trap, where they'll privilege written sources over oral histories. They'll privilege sources written by certain types of people over sources that other segments of society might have. Often a lot of history was written by men. You find very few female voices in history. The job of a historian often is to read between the lines, to read against the grain, and then get to the bottom of things. So when you say that, say, Setu Lakshmibai of Travancore, in many ways she was privileged. She was a woman, but she was a queen. She was a ruler. She actually held and wielded power for 7 years, managed crores of rupees, etc. So on the face of it, there's a lot of documentation about her. But she ended up being marginalized on the axis of gender. Her successor, who was a male figure who didn't get along with her, ended up reducing her value in that period. And she essentially faded out of the historical record and vanished. So there was an act of retrieval, but there were documents available. For a lot of other cases, there aren't even documents available because those women or those characters come from lower down the social hierarchy. So you don't have documents, you don't have written sources, you only have oral narratives. Then how do you recover these people? Then how do you tell their stories? So the historian is constantly in an effort to try and understand how to read between the lines and tease out things between the lines. Now, when we say history is always written by the victors, we also shouldn't take it to the extreme of assuming that it was some kind of great conspiracy. For example, when we study a lot of colonial history, a lot of the records were left by the British. Now, when the British are writing, it is white men writing about brown people. So there's already one tilt over there. It is a dominant ruling class writing about a suppressed group of people. So there is another layer of complexity there. At the same time, a serious historian doesn't fully dismiss it saying, oh, anything written by white people is bad. You're able to tease out things from there and analyze it in a way that allows you to extract the prejudices and still get to the grain of something that is useful, that can be used for your research, etc. So it's always an interesting, almost journalistic exercise. I was listening to a podcast the other day on Iran and what's happening in Iran just now by Stanley Journey, who's the foreign affairs editor at The Hindu. And he was talking in it about how in Iran, because of the current crisis, you have, of course, the Iranian regime putting out numbers and facts and figures, etc. But you also have Iranian dissidents in the diaspora abroad, aided by the Western media, putting out their own figures. And he's talking about how both are equally exaggerated and skewed. The Iranian regime deliberately underplays, the diaspora abroad and the Western media deliberately overplays the facts and figures and what is happening. And how the role of the journalist is to try and analyze these and get to a reasonable conclusion as to what is actually happening. And in some ways, that's what the historian also does. When you say that records are written by victors or records are written by men, etc., all of that is true. All of these records have their own politics. All of these sources have their own problems. But the historian is trained to analyze that and still try and reach a reasonable conclusion. I always say that we can never guarantee that we've reached the truth. We are connecting dots and reaching a conclusion based on available evidence, analyzing it a certain way, trying to be as objective and even-handed as possible. But it is always a quest. It is always an effort. And it is always something that will be changed or it is likely to be changed when new evidence comes to the fore or different aspects are illustrated, which we weren't aware of earlier. Sometimes looking at the same evidence from a new perspective can actually help you reach new conclusions. So this is an ongoing, constant process of revising what is there. And historical revisionism in that sense is what history is about. It is about debate. It is about constantly challenging past wisdom to try and clarify things better.
One of my favorite rooms in any museum is at the Met, at the Egyptian wing, where they have dedicated...
You clearly like the Met.
I love the Met. It's a highlight of my life. But every time I went to the Met, I went to this one room, which is this room dedicated to an ancient Egyptian queen, Hatshepsut. And they say right at the entrance that the only reason we were able to get so many statues of her was because someone actively tried to erase her from history, probably her son, Amenhotep. And as a result, the statues that were left up probably got destroyed. But because they had just taken up all these statues and put them in a pit, archaeologists discovered them nearly intact. And as a result, now she has an entire room at the Met itself, which is ironic, right? Because otherwise she might have just gone down in history as just another name, just another queen in Egyptian history. You've explored something similar with Khunza Humayun Begum, reduced to a blob in paintings. You've explored this with Mudalini as well. Work was banned as well. Do you think the act of trying to erase someone, this act that they call damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, that in itself makes these people 10 times more interesting, which is already ironic because now you're getting an extra comment on what was the zeitgeist of the times that someone actively tried to remove them from history.
Yes and no, in the sense that I think when someone goes out of their way to suppress something, often what happens is you suppress the main sources, but because suppression itself is a violent act, there are ways in which it bubbles up into crevices and corners and survives there. So you might end up finding traces and perspectives elsewhere. All the same, if you look at the broad arc of history, for every person we've been able to recover, there may be 10 people who we haven't been able to recover because they actually have been obliterated. And because, the history is also susceptible to things like rain and nature and fires and natural destruction. We live in a tropical country, right? Where I come from in Kerala, all the records were maintained in palm leaf manuscripts. And at different times, these would disintegrate. There'd be a termite problem. In my own family in the 90s, apparently my grandfather emptied out several shelves of palm leaf manuscripts and just threw it in the fire. Because he's like, who's going to look at these anymore? And I grew up to be a historian, and now I sort of crib that, why did he do that? If it was just 10 years later, I would have preserved those. So there's a lot that is lost purely by accident, often. There are whole cities that have gone under volcanic ash. There are whole places that have been destroyed. So yes, there is a lot to be said about people being actively erased, but then surviving in the margins and then being resurrected at later periods. There's also politics to it in that, say there is a political ideology that's dominant at a certain time that plays up certain historical figures and marginalizes other historical figures. 200 years later, maybe there's a new political ideology, and that looks at that marginalized figure, brings that up as a totemic sort of emblem of their movement or their ideas, and sort of exaggerates the importance of that person or sort of revivifies their memory, etc. So this is also cyclical in some terms. There are certain historical figures who are fashionable at certain points, then they get marginalized, then 200 years later they might come back in a different form. Historical figures are also being constantly reinvented. Every generation, when we look at these historical figures, we are also projecting our values, what we are seeking in the present, onto them. I grew up in Maharashtra, right? So Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra, he was a man from the 17th century, a heroic figure from that era. But this generation is constantly interpreting, reinterpreting, and he is a motif and a symbol for many diverse forces that are very 20th and 21st century. Because every generation keeps resurrecting historical figures in ways that appeal to them. So all of these things exist at the same time. People being marginalized, people being revived, who's reviving, why they're reviving. It's a very fascinating dynamic in general.
There's this hotly contested debate among historians for sure. Who's in the driving seat of history? Is it great individuals as suggested by the great man theory? Or are these events and individuals just byproducts of larger forces, which is the Marxist view? What I find interesting in your work, and this is another pattern that emerges, is that, like you mentioned, you like exploring these everyday stories, these everyday nitty-gritties, forgotten stories as well, that sits somewhere between structure and agency. You often talk about stories that your grandmother told you, stories from the Serpent Grove next to your ancestral home in Alleppey. And what I find interesting is there's a difference between talking about the life of, let's say, Akbar, or talking about a person who lived during the times of Akbar, because in one sense, you're getting a much better picture of what actual life is like. Akbar lived a life of one, maybe, very unique, right? But if you really want a reflection of the social, cultural, political forces during that time, you probably have to explore one of these forgotten stories. So what is the benefit? What new perspective does it give you to explore these lives of these everyday people or these forgotten people, not the great individuals, not the larger forces, although these people might be contributing to the larger forces? What new insights does it give you?
You have to look at broader trends in society because often, as we were discussing earlier, the records that we have, the hard evidence we have is often left by elites and privileged people. Everyday forces, even look at material evidence, right? You go to a place like Hampi, we have the temples, we have the historical ruins there. But the frank truth is most people would have lived in homes made of thatch and timber, etc., perishable stuff. So ordinary houses don't survive. What survive are monumental buildings. It's the same, I was talking to Soumya Ashok, this other author, and she's talking about how the Chola kings, they've left these grand stone temples in Tamil Nadu, but we don't really know where their palaces were. Because clearly those palaces perhaps were made of material that disintegrated over a period of time. So the remains don't exist in the same way that they exist for granite-made temples. So even the material evidence sometimes is of a certain type, whereas everyday people's material evidence doesn't always survive. Increasingly now, of course, we're finding stuff. So Pompeii, for example, because the whole city went under ash, there's all kinds of interesting goods that you can find there. But in general, it's tough sometimes. It is a privileged people and their stuff that you find. So then you analyze these social trends. You try to even read, say, poetry or tax records, etc. All of these sources you try to read to understand what ordinary people were living like. What was a trader's life like in Akbar's time? What were the traders' worries and concerns? The king and the emperor sitting in Agra doing whatever. But what is a trader? Is there security for the trader? How is money being exchanged at this time? What was the banking system like? These give you some answers as to how society at a broader level or the economy at a broader level operated. What was an everyday peasant's life like? For example, in my village, it is through oral narratives of the erstwhile Dalit, communities who were slaves at one point in Kerala. It is their stories that tell you how actual life on the farm was led versus the life in the landlord's house. Because again, they don't have hard evidence, but they have songs that they sang in the fields as they tilled. They have songs of their own local heroes from their communities, etc., who are not written about in any textbooks, but they exist in these songs. You have to then tease out these aspects from such sources. Coming to the great man part of your question, I think that's an interesting thing because at one point, it was very fashionable to do history from this great man perspective, where history is all about charismatic figures, great heroes coming in and changing the world forever, very romantic affairs. Whereas I think the balance to that is that yes, while charismatic, important individuals can make a major difference. For example, we're living in a time when we have a prime minister who is very clearly different from previous prime ministers. He's leaving an outsized impact on the country, and there the person clearly matters. It isn't just processes. There are processes that led to him, but he as a man is also creating new processes. So it sort of one feeds into the other. So again, I wouldn't draw a stark contrast between great men and...
But if not for him, would someone else with a similar ideology just step into place? Is he just a byproduct of a larger force?
He's emerged because of larger forces. Larger forces have set the ground for someone like him to emerge. But at the same time, I would argue that he also has some distinct qualities that allows him to represent those larger forces. Let me give you another example from 100 years ago. This concept of Hindutva, for example, it was bubbling around for quite some time, right? From the late 19th century, from in Bengal, in Maharashtra, people were even using the word. People were trying to define it in different ways. But the way in which it found its final enduring definition was when a man called Savarkar gave it a certain definition. And his arriving at that definition wasn't merely because of those processes. It was also because of certain individual impulses and individual experiences. So what I'm saying is that it's actually a confluence sometimes in history of the two, which is that there is processes leading to something, and there are processes that are sort of bubbling up in general. But sometimes you find this weird alignment where an individual also pops up who's able to, in many ways, exemplify all those processes and sharpen it. And in the course of doing that, they also set off a whole new set of forces and a whole new set of dynamics, if you get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So it's constantly sort of interacting with each other. And it isn't the case that it is only this or it is only that. So as much as we must not skew ourselves only to the great man theory, we also shouldn't assume that processes somehow exist in isolation from individuals, because I think individuals do have a major part to play. Who's ultimately creating these processes? It is society. And society is constituted of human beings. And human beings, therefore, and human responses to these things are what lead to a lot of these processes emerging. So yeah, it's a complicated dynamic.
It's both structure and agency. You brought up Hindutva, so let's explore this further. This is another pattern that's emerged in a lot of your work. You've explored how groups evolve, how a religion evolves, how a society evolves. In Gods, Guns and Missionaries, you explore how Hindutva has evolved as well. And what jumps out to me is there seems to be a template or a formula in place. A group of people come together, they're bound by some common factor. Then they selectively remember their ancestors, maybe they apotheosize them, glorify them. Some rituals keep getting passed on, those become subcultures. And then interestingly, most groups then try to look for an antagonist. So whether it's maybe the Rajputs for the Marathas, or Mughals for the Marathas, or the Pandavas for the Kauravas, or nowadays Muslims for the Hindus. And then by setting that as your moral benchmark, then you, through conflict, try to progress moving forward. Is that true? Is there a template? Is there a formula for how religion develops and ethnic group develops?
A lot of identity formation requires another. For me to say, I am this, I have to not be something else.
It's imperative to have this?
I mean, if you look at it historically, it seems to be the case, often.
You need conflict.
Not conflict, but you need something to contrast yourself against. So if I'm a Roman, I'm not a barbarian. You're calling everybody else a barbarian, and so on and so forth. So I think there's always an other that makes identity formation a lot easier. At the same time, identity isn't some kind of simple hat that you wear because frankly, all of us as individuals wear multiple hats. In my own case, I could wear a caste hat and define myself against other caste groups. I could wear a regional hat as a Malayali and define myself against Tamilians or people from UP or whatever. When I go abroad, so in India, if someone asks me, where are you from? I might say Kerala, I might say Maharashtra. But if I go abroad, I'll say, I'm from India. There you won't really wear the hat of your state. You'll be wearing the hat of your country. In another context, you may be wearing your religious hat because, say, you're going on a pilgrimage and you're like, oh, yes, we are Hindus going on such and such a pilgrimage. But elsewhere, you might actually, again, break it down to a regional identity. So in different contexts, we're constantly wearing different hats. And I think most people have not one, but multiple identities in play. It isn't the case that somehow there is one identity that we hold up as supreme in some way. Although I suppose in the modern world, we are encouraged to think of one supreme identity, the truth, I think, is there are multiple identities. And all of them, in some way or the other, build on contrasting themselves against other identities or other people or other groups. And that is a source of conflict. It's also a source of unity in some contexts that can vary.
In Alleppey, there is a Murugan temple where once a kid made an offering of a Munch chocolate.
I see you've kept
product placement, sponsor me Munch. So, and then he was immediately cured of his illness. And since that day, everyone started making offerings of just Munch chocolate. Now, we may find the humor in this today, but I'm sure in a few years, this might become gospel. In a century, this could also become a religion of its own. Because if you really try to trace the source of many rituals, they're quite random. In Ujjain, there's the Ghadi Wale Baba, where people make offerings of clocks if they want their visa applications to be processed in time. There's another temple in Kerala where if the coconut is not smashed into two equal halves, your wish is not going to be granted.
I've gone there.
Oh, you've gone there?
I've gone there, yeah.
Perfect. You have the lived experience of it. And then there are other temples where the same goddess is worshipped in a different way in the morning, in a different way in the afternoon, in a different way in the evening. In your book, Gods, Guns and Missionaries, you explore this making of the modern Hindu identity. And what immediately jumps out to me now that you mention Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, before we even talk about the pros and cons of ethno-nationalism, I'm very confused on what is a Hindu identity because it doesn't seem to me that there's a foundational, in a way, pure idea of what Hinduism is, but rather it seems to be this collection, this amalgamation of so many different rituals, subcultures that have only developed in their own pockets in isolation. And that's all come under this one blanket term. So is there one core idea of what a Hindu identity is, or is it just a collection?
People are trying to find that core idea that defines all Hindus. That continues to be a quest that defines our politics and activities, culture, etc., even today. But the point is, I think conceptually we're looking at it in a wrong way. We are assuming, and when I say we, I think most of the world assumes, because partly the dominant Eurocentric frame is that religious identity has to have one fount. And therefore, we try to retrofit a lot of non-European ideas and religious identities also into that box and try to define those non-Indian or non-European ideas according to that conceptual formulation. Whereas the problem is that, not the problem, but the difference in the world is that maybe that's how things evolved in Europe. Maybe that's how it evolved with certain kinds of faith in their religious identities. In India, it's actually the other way around. You have multiple fonts which coalesce over a period of time and sort of arrange themselves in an equilibrium through a network of that is shared, even if the ideas within that may be different. For example, think of a pyramid. And there are different slots in this pyramid. Everything has its place within the pyramid. There is also a hierarchy maybe, but everything has its individual slots. Everything's not springing out of the same thing. So I think conceptually, we need to think slightly differently when we think of Indian identity or religious identity in India, etc., which is that it's not the same as how it might have emerged in a different context. Again, a product of history. So we're in some ways doing something artificial by trying to force fit the one defining quality of all Hindus kind of thing and trying to seek that out because that is a very Western conceptual way of looking at religious identity. Whereas here, I think people had a slightly different, looser form of identity. Again, people trying to find that one core element is also a product of history. It is because of colonialism. It is because of exposure to other faiths. It is because of certain pressures that were felt, that they felt that in a defensive way, they had to come up with something to unify all of these loosely held connections in that network and make it a much more solid, sort of muscular identity. So identity is also constantly evolving. Again, that's the other thing, right? No identity is a monolith. No identity remains constant across centuries and across millennia. It is constantly breathing and constantly evolving. Tradition itself holds on to some aspects, so there is continuity, but in many other ways, it is also constantly evolving and changing. So tradition is actually a very dynamic affair. Tradition isn't a rock that is unchanging over a period of time. And it's the same with identity. Identity also changes and breeds, etc. When you say that, does Hinduism have that one defining quality that defines all Hindus? I would argue that we shouldn't even look necessarily for that one thing, because that's not the way our history and our culture evolved in India. It is a consequence of colonialism and the Western gaze that even causes us to assume that we need to find such a unifying central core element.
Earlier, you brought up a world which is becoming increasingly standardized, globalized. You spoke about how we might look very different centuries ago, but today we pretty much have the same hairstyle, same type of clothes as well.
Not centuries ago. Literally 50, 60 years ago, we would have looked
50,
different.
60 years ago, we would have looked different. If we applied, because nowadays there's a rhetoric for a Hindu Rashtra, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism. If we start applying a national agenda to a religion, do we run the same risk of homogenizing an entire religion as well? And there's precedent for this. Happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. Pockets of culture were completely destroyed because you're now starting to apply this national level framework to something that's extremely personal, right? Faith is a very extremely personal venture that you go on your own. But now if the government comes and tells me how to be a Hindu, it might actually destroy a lot of the depth or the beauty of any religion. Is that a risk, or do you think a national level agenda can actually strengthen a religion even further?
I would argue it this way, which is that faith, you said it's a very personal thing, right? Faith is a very personal thing. Your beliefs are a very personal thing. How you worship your God, what format you use, which God you choose to worship in Hindu, all of this is very personal. Religious identity, on the other hand, has always been fairly political, because identity tends to be political. Identity isn't necessarily only about, this is the God I believe in. Identity is actually linked to political trends. It's linked to protecting certain ideas. It is about we versus them. It is about us being one group and someone else being another group. The moment you start talking groups, you're talking politics. So it's, in that sense, religious identities has always been political. And for that reason, it is also great fodder for politics, not just in the past, but even in the present. Now, to your question as to whether imposing things by diktat can backfire and make us lose things, I believe it can. In the sense that when you try to straitjacket something, you take away a lot of the vitality. Has it happened in the past? It has. There have been states, there's a scholar called Divyacharyan who's written about the Marwar state in Rajputana and how the government there in the 18th century actively tried to push certain values, certain ideas that came from one segment of society and push it onto a broader segment of society. And because there was state power involved, a lot of it was, they were successful in great measure in pushing it. If you look at the expansion of Christianity, there are scholars who've written about how the conversion of kings and the fact that power now sided with this emerging new force did bring about certain changes in history. The vanishing of feminine gods and the emergence of a masculine monotheistic god, that was one of the byproducts of that change. So I will never underestimate the power of power to bring about changes in the way religious identity is expressed. At a personal level, I think it can cause a loss of vitality. It can cause a loss of a lot of that texture. It can cause a lot of the layers. Homogeneity. So the thing is, political identities want homogeneity because that's how you unite people. You create a solid block that is able to stand up against the other. But in creating that, we also flatten out a lot of the inner diversity. We flatten out a lot of the inner variety. So it's always a constant tussle and always a constant push and pull, to which, frankly, I don't know what will ultimately prevail. But personally, I feel that it's a losing battle. I think that we, especially in a country like India, we stand to lose a lot if our religious identity becomes completely homogenized and everybody has the same way and the same set of ideas and the same practice of religion, etc. I think the magic of Hinduism has been that it has been, it has room. It's a very roomy kind of system. As I mentioned earlier, it's more a network. It's more a shared framework rather than one solid, defined, this is the only way kind of religion. I think that to me personally, it would be a sense of loss, that pressure from above in terms of defining religion.
I'll send your feedback to all those ethno-nationalist countries and I'll auto-forward all the emails that I get in return. If this is the stance, and this is something you've explored for a while, Srinath Raghavan had once said, history does not teach lessons, it is historians who do. So what is the purpose of books like God, Guns and Missionaries? Are you trying to infuse some pedagogy? Are you trying to maybe teach a lesson to some people who have been too radicalized, have an extreme viewpoint? Is that the role that you have to play in society, or is your role the role of a historian? You're just here to document, archive things?
I am trying to understand things partly for myself, because often, a book emerges from a question that emerges in your mind and you're looking for an answer.
What was the question that emerged in your mind?
Depends. For example, in my first book, why was this woman marginalized? Why was she turned into a footnote when she seems so interesting? So trying to answer that question led to a 700-page book. With Gods, Guns and Missionaries, it felt like, okay, everyone's looking at the Hindu identity through the prism of Hindu-Muslim relations. But why am I getting the sense that colonialism and Christianity had an important role to play here? And how do I answer that question? So you're often trying to find an answer to a question that's been playing on your mind itself. And you argue it in a certain way, you do your research, you collect the material, and you're able to therefore present it to people and hopefully sort of illustrate to them as well that, hold on, this might actually give you some answers as well. If it was able to give me an answer, it might give you an answer as well. The only thing as a historian that I'm interested in teaching in quotes, is not an active conclusion. It is just to get people to think. Which is that anytime you get received wisdom, anytime you swallow something whole without asking questions, just pause for a second and ask those questions. Just pause for a second and wonder, wait, could there be another explanation for this? So I think the role of a historian in some ways, if at all we're teaching lessons, is to just get people to think and to sometimes think against the grain, to sometimes read between the lines, as I was saying earlier, to sometimes just not assume that acquired information or received wisdom is the final conclusion on something. There is, I think, something good in people starting to question things a little bit. So it's just about asking healthy questions more than anything else.
If I had to play devil's advocate to this, since you're the expert, or at least you've spent more time with this material, you've studied these social political forces, you see what's happened in history, which a lot of people might not have an inkling of. Why not double down? Why not play a bigger role as one of those philosophers like Deen Dayal Upadhyay, or even Gandhi, who saw their role as not someone who's archiving or just holding up a mirror and making people think, but rather shaping or guiding society. So if you know where this is going to head and you know it's bad, why not be more specific and let's specifically try to push people in a particular direction?
If I ever want to do that, I'd just enter politics, right? Because essentially that is political. Because you're now trying to shape society in a certain direction, where you're taking history or you're drawing on certain aspects of history selectively in order to drive a certain message and through that drive a certain agenda. Whether it's the right, whether it's the left, across the political spectrum, everyone does that. All political parties have ideologies. And how are the ideologies justified? Through a selective reading of history. And when I use the word selective, I'm not judging, because I often argue that there is history as a discipline where you study the facts and figures and you try to be clinical, you try to be even-handed, etc. But there's also history in a more emotional sense, which is communities drawing their sense of self, their sense of meaning in the world. They engage with the past, not clinically. They engage with the past emotionally. They engage with the past through a moral lens. They engage with the past through a notion of good and bad, whereas historians don't look at good and bad. Historians are not trained to look at what is good and what is bad. When historians study Hitler, it's not because they like Hitler, but he was an important figure at that time. Even if he's a bad figure or a negative figure, you need to study him to understand what happened at that time, right? So there are two ways of engaging with history. Communities and people and politicians and political groups engage with it from an almost emotional lens because they have a goal in mind and they need to push society in that direction. Whereas historians study it sometimes, or they should be studying it mostly, from a much more clinical lens. The problem arrives when historians also start falling into silos and sides. I think for me at least, I think that the role of the historian is to try and be above it. Try and be. It's not always easy because we are also human beings. We also have our positions. We also have our political ideas, etc. But the historian, ideally, if you claim to be a historian, should be above board a little bit and even-handed and be prepared to be led by the evidence, even if it leads you in directions that you may not personally like.
That's in the process of writing the book. And I agree. Okay, let's say you write a neutral account of how Hitler became Hitler. While you're in the process of exploration, sure, that is exactly the path you should take to get through all the ideas. But then towards the end, you want to teach a lesson, right? You want to say this shouldn't be repeated in the past. So at that point, you need to double down.
You can leave that to the reader to pick up on their own.
What if they don't? Then you run the risk,
I'm
right?
sure they will. I mean, that's the broader moral compass of society, right? Which exists irrespective of historians, which is that every generation has a broad moral compass. For example, our moral compass is changing in the present. Post-social media, post-truth, post-fact, all of that. A lot of those moral things that were taken as settled are now up in the air, right? People are constantly challenging and questioning it. We are living through a time of flux. But in, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would have reached those conclusions because there was a settled moral understanding of what is good and what is bad. I don't think the historian needs to force feed or spoon feed these things. For me personally, maybe because I'm also as a human being slightly detached in life, I'm emotionally a slightly detached person. So it could just be that speaking. I think my role is to point out that this happened, reach certain conclusions, explain why I've reached those conclusions through the evidence, and then leave it to the reader to decide what they want to do with it. When I was doing my latest book, Gods, Guns and Missionaries, this came up several times because people kept asking me, saying, some of the things you talk in the first chapter, for example, about the Portuguese coming in, forcefully converting people to Christianity, etc. It could be used against Christians in Goa today. It could be used by the right wing to target minorities. And I actually had a conversation with a senior scholar, several senior scholars, and I remember all of them said, look, you have to go by the evidence. You have to talk about these things. How people will use this can't be the basis. You can't write from a defensive perspective of, oh my God, this may be misused, so therefore let me try to write it a certain way, or let me try to sort of cushion it a certain way. If you do that, that leads to other complications. Then, that is why people end up accusing historians of twisting history or playing down certain things, etc. It's not an easy question to answer because, as I said, morality matters. I think there is a moral compass. But personally, I think historians need to be slightly detached in how they sort of address these things and not get too swayed in teaching lessons.
What role does language play in all this? Because if you're trying to make people think, at least for a book specifically, let's say Gods and Guns, maybe there's a bigger case to be made to write it in Hindi, right? To reach maybe the people who follow this ideology. So then, is this something you critically think about, the language in which you're expressing your ideas and making them think?
नहीं, अभी मैं हिंदी में बात ऐसे थोड़ी बहुत कर सकता हूँ, मगर मैं हिंदी में लिख नहीं सकता हूँ. तो मेरी लिखने की भाषा English है. So I'm able to express the ideas in English. Therefore, I write in English. Now, it can be translated in future, etc. But you're right. I think English reaches only a certain segment of Indian society. Languages do
probably
matter.
don't even need to think about this idea. Maybe it's not the audience that you really need to target, right, for this book.
Perhaps. I mean, the funny thing though is the book's been, I think, translated into Marathi, Malayalam, etc. But Hindi, strangely, I still haven't got any interest from a publisher. So again, I think that interest has to bubble up from there. But on my part, one thing I do actively do is that in addition to a lot of talks in English, I do a lot of talks in Malayalam, which is my mother tongue. Because I find that English writing, English events, I'm addressing largely a cosmopolitan, urban kind of elite. Whereas when I do Malayalam talks in Kerala, the kids who come up from smaller towns, from villages, kids who may not actually read English books, often kids who can't afford English books because English books in hardback, etc. are expensive. But when they come and when I'm speaking in Malayalam, they're able to take away the same content in a different format. So I do a lot of work in Indian languages, not publishing so much, but I do engage a lot in my mother tongue in Malayalam, whether it's through YouTube dialogues, events, etc. Just so that I can also put this out there for a broader audience in an Indian language. But Hindi में मैंने अभी तक कोशिश नहीं की है.
I mean, your Hindi is amazing. So
if anyone, it's
and
not
if you
amazing, but
sit and write, obviously it's a different.
I was one of those strange anomalies, and I think in school this always happened where in Marathi and Hindi, because I grew up in Maharashtra, the toppers were always South Indians or non-Hindi, non-Marathi speakers, whereas native Marathi and Hindi speakers never managed to get the good marks in it because I don't know, we were learning it in a sense, whereas they just picked it up at home, I guess.
This is my pet peeve. I was a subject prize winner in Hindi, which means like you get the maximum marks in all your 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. And board exams, CBSE, I got B1. And people from Kerala who were memorizing Hindi like we memorized Arabic, who didn't know the meaning of any word, they got A1. And it was good. I was kicked out of the house.
I have a story from when my grandmother went to live in Jodhpur with my grandfather. He was in the Air Force. And the first day, she was there alone. He went to work and he said, look, you're here now. You must find out the neighboring lady's name. Basically, he meant go and make friends with her. Yeah. And then in the evening, he came back and he asked her, what is the neighbor's wife's name? Have you made friends with her? And she said, yeah, I found out her name. Because she actually didn't go and make friends. She heard someone call that lady's name. And she told my grandfather, her name is Penji. Penji. Oh. It's actually Behenji. Benji, someone was calling her Behenji constantly. My grandmother said, her name is Penji. And funnily enough, my grandmother was a trained school Hindi teacher. She was meant to be a Hindi teacher in Kerala, but she couldn't tell the difference between Behenji and Penji because the accent came in. And she assumed Penji was just the lady's name.
So you're not at that level, so I'm sure you can write a book in Hindi. So you think about
Dekhte
it.
Dekhte hain. Ek din, koshish karenge.
Koshish karenge. Let me know. Keep me posted. Send me an email when that starts. Next pattern that I want to explore in your work, and you brought this up as well, is the nature of power, the psychology of power. And you've explored this tangentially at times in The Ivory Throne, in Rebel Sultans, in False Allies. There is a phrase in the book The Power Broker by Robert Caro where he says, politics is a thief's game. Those who stay in it long enough are invariably robbed. Daniel Day-Lewis had said in an interview for There Will Be Blood, he had said many people get into politics to conquer it, but then politics ends up conquering them. And there's this maxim, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You've studied power. What is the nature of power? How do individuals, institutions garner power? Is it only the evil ones that will make it to the top? Or can good people also make it to the top and not get corrupted by power?
I have a problem with good people because again, that's a judgment.
It's an ambiguous term.
But no, but I think from my very first book, the very fact that I wrote about Setu Lakshmibai of Travancore, and the antagonist of the book is her sister, Setu Parvati Bai, very similar sounding names, Senior Maharani and Junior Maharani of Travancore, operating in this matrilineal system where both women wield considerable power in their own ways. But what's interesting is that the family dynamic almost entirely breaks down because power enters the equation. And that I found very fascinating. What power does to human beings, what power does to relationships, how power can corrupt family bonds. Because the stakes are so high, there is so much to lose. And the very yearning for power, the very attraction that power holds is such that it doesn't matter that you're sacrificing certain family relations. Because that is ultimately what draws a wedge between these two women and ends up breaking their relationship. And one ends up living in exile and dying here in Bangalore as a non-entity. And the other one ends up, in a sense, the victor of the story.
Is it power itself, or is it just amplifying? Is it holding up a mirror and amplifying what traits they already had or what tensions they had?
I think both. No, it's possible because, of course, as human beings, we have certain traits. Some of us are more likely to do something. Other people are less likely to do something. Some people are very confident. Other people are more gentle and shy. Some people may be very good in a bookish sense. Other people may be more street smart. All of that exists. To that extent, maybe power creates avenues and platforms for certain types of people to thrive and other people who may not be able to thrive in that. But what is more interesting is that yearning for power itself, right? Everything from pregnancy, as I said, even their sexual life had a political connotation to it. Even when they got pregnant, the question was, oh, will this one give birth to the next heir or will that one give birth to the next heir? So producing a child becomes a race between two sisters, and the one who produces the child has a lower title, but now the existence of the heir means that her status rises and she can claim a greater share of power. The other one is the senior in terms of rank, but she doesn't have the heir to the throne. So that creates its own dissonance between the two sisters. So essentially, one family gets split into two households. That leads to essentially, for all practical purposes, two families. And then it's a vendetta and a feud between these two palaces and these two women occupying these two different households. So power essentially comes in and does cause a certain degree of corruption there. Take it at a broader level of someone like Jawaharlal Nehru, right? In his writings, it's all wonderful, freedom of expression, this, that. But the moment he becomes prime minister, one of the first changes they bring about in the constitutional arrangements in our legal system is books were banned already in the 1950s. Because now having wielded power, having enjoyed power, now the stakes are high. You have to weigh and sort of consider all kinds of questions. So Aubrey Menon's Ramayana retold, no, it'll cause trouble. That'll be a problem for me. That book needs to be banned. So someone who would have been a freedom of expression and almost an evangelist for that in an earlier life, when he's in power, has to think from a different frame and therefore can do things that are slightly authoritarian in nature, etc. So even someone like Nehru, who actually was a great Democrat, he was, in terms of his values, he was very much a Democrat. And compared to, how Indian politics has evolved since, I think he was certainly better than a lot of politicians who came later, including his own daughter, Indira Gandhi. Yet, in power, he had to make certain compromises. So power does change even the most idealistic people. It's always easier to be a poet when you're just a poet. To put the poet on a throne and the poet will also become a bit of a tyrant is my somewhat pessimistic / realistic take on this.
So there's no winning, huh?
With power, I suppose not. Because power, it is already an unequal terrain, right? Wielding power means you have something which other people don't. And then I suppose it's very tough to sort of stay on the right side of the line and not be tempted to somehow misuse it or somehow sort of push yourself, get your way, etc. It would take a very, very secure person to be able to hold power and still be very saintly in their behavior. I don't think it's easy. Setu Lakshmibai of Travancore was a very nice lady, but in power, even she passed a press regulation that clamped down on freedom of expression because, it does that.
Albus Dumbledore in Harry Potter had said, it's a curious thing, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are the ones who never actively sorted. So I guess you and Dumbledore are in agreement.
Oh, good Lord. Actually, my favorite character in Harry Potter was Lord Voldemort because I found him emotionally a far more complex character. Dumbledore talking about love and good. Again, as I said, that's a poet. Voldemort is really what human beings are more like. So again, I think in many ways, the story is also setting up an ideal, saying this is what we ought to be, whereas this is reality. And I think all of human existence is a constant push and pull between what we actually are and what we know we ought to be. And in some ways, the Dumbledore-Voldemort contrast is also that.
10 points to Slytherin, I guess. Okay.
I wouldn't have minded being a Slytherin. I'd have been deeply offended to be in Gryffindor.
You know, same here. I actually thought Gryffindor was pretty one-dimensional. But if I say this in public, people start judging you. Anyway, that's a separate thesis on its own. But while we talk about power, you've presented a very nuanced view of power and politics over the years because there's a widespread assumption the British were the colonizers, Indians were the ones colonized. They were just mere subjects. But as you've shown in your books, especially these princely states, these Maharanis, these Maharajas, the Sultans, they were not just passive agents. They were not false allies. There were partnerships. There was pushback. They were shrewd, active players. So how do we look back on colonial history now if we start giving more weight to the power and authority that these regions had?
The British were the colonizers and we were the ones who were colonized. My problem is when we flatten that into, oh my God, they were these like all-powerful oppressors and we were these like passive, suffering people. The frank truth is there was constant tension and there was constant pushback. The British knew it. Which is why, for example, the British invested so much in building monumental buildings and having these great demonstrations of their power through great ceremonies and darbars, the kind of robes they'd wear, the decorations and titles they would hand out. All of that was a constant effort to build legitimacy for yourself, for themselves. The very act of building legitimacy comes from knowing that you are in some ways not legitimate. So there is always an insecurity in the white man's mind in India that ultimately it's 100,000 or maximum 200,000 people governing millions of people and we are ultimately aliens here. So they were aware of that. Similarly, the Indians on this side, even because of the power being lopsided, because ultimately hard power was in the colonizer's hand, they did have to sort of make their peace with that system for a long duration. But even within that, there were ways of subverting it. For example, a lot of the bureaucracy was manned by Indians and the British were often astonished by this, right? Like a lot of them wanted to civilize Indians, a lot of them wanted to Christianize India, etc. But they would find that Indians who were getting into the bureaucracy, getting paid by the colonial state, would use that money to do even greater pujas, to sponsor even bigger temples, to sponsor local dancing girls, etc. And actually funnel that colonially created wealth into local forms of art and culture. In other places, yes, the British state was able to wipe out patronage for a lot of things, but often people within the British ecosystem who were Indians were able to actually use that to build on Indian traditions and Indian identity, etc. People picked up the English language and the British thought, okay, now they're going to read Western texts, give up their Indian identity and essentially become brown men in the white man's clothes. But in reality, they picked up the English language and ended up turning that against the British themselves. Yes, they read about democracy and then they started questioning the British saying, hold on, democracy is what you believe in. These are these great ideals your books are talking about. Why don't we have democracy here? Why don't we have rights here? If you're saying that all human beings are created equal and your God says that all human beings are created equal in the kingdom of God, etc., why is it that the brown man is discriminated against vis-a-vis the white man? So there is a way in which even the oppressed person or the subject class can weaponize aspects of the dominant ruler's ideology and ideas and weaponize that against the ruler himself. And that's essentially what happens in the colonial period. And it's happening in multiple levels. Pre-colonial period, say from a caste perspective, while it is true that upper caste dominated, elite groups dominated, etc., there was always pushback from underneath. All of Bhakti literature is pushback against caste at one level. There are women pushing back against patriarchy if you look at some of the poetry that's coming out in this period. So it's interesting that that people always have agency and people always attempt to assert agency. It comes at a great price. It can often cause them great losses. But at the same time, human beings instinctively, I think, have that capacity for agency, even when power dynamics are lopsided. So my whole point is that the colonial era isn't a simplistic affair. There's a lot going on over there. Sometimes you mentioned the Rajas, they are using ritual. Hard power, yes, they're weaker than the British, so they weaponize ritual and they weaponize other things to try and put the British in place. I often give this example of how in Travancore, every time white people wanted to visit members of the royal family, they would have to visit before 8 o'clock in the morning because that way you could shake hands with the white people and then the Rani or the Raja would go and take a ritual bath to purify themselves. The British are dominant, but by going and washing and taking a bath after meeting the British, you're essentially also making a statement that, you may be dominant politically, but from a caste perspective, we are higher than the white man. The white man is just a mlecha. He's beyond the pale completely. They would organize these big banquets for these British officials and governors visiting, but the Hindus attending would never eat there. They would sit there with a lemon in their hand, and the lemon, why do people hang lemons outside their doors with that black figure, etc.? Why do people hang lemons on their new cars, etc.? Because it's believed to absorb the evil eye and absorb impurity. So yes, politically, we have no option but to hold a banquet for this visiting viceroy or visiting British governor. But I will also sit there with a lemon because I know it's an impure context, and let the governor eat. I will not eat. I'll just sit there with my lemon. These were always used to make political statements as well. So even in that colonial dynamic, I don't think Indians lost agency. Even when the British were dominant, they were able to weaponize a lot of British created ideas and knowledge systems and even language for their own causes and uses, and ultimately force the British into a corner and bring about the exit of the British.
It's a very fresh, nuanced view of history because you're right, there's this simplistic assumption that there was only one group that had power and authority and one that, but there was this constant push and pull. You've explored a similar push and pull with women in history as well. Once again, similar assumption that men were in control and women were just passive agents. But as you've explored with the lives of, you've explored the matrilineal societies in Kerala, you explored the life of Sethu Lakshmibai, Junior Rani, Rani Chennamma, Begums of Bengal, also explored the role of Devdasis in community. Within the patriarchal context, there was push and pull. These are people that had some power, influence, some amount of privilege. So how does that change our view of women in history as well?
A lot of women are not written about, partly because the social mores of that time wouldn't allow for them to be written about. It was considered bad form in some places to write about women. So even if women actually did things, it would not make it to the record because it is not considered proper to sort of talk about those things. Forget matrimony. Even in patriarchal settings, you find that women have ways of asserting agency despite the odds being stacked against them. So, say, a lot of these Maratha queens, for example, I give in my book False Allies the story of Jamnabai. It's not even that long ago, 19th century figure. She's, 13 or 14 years old? She's a teenager. Not from a very rich family, but she has the right blood. She comes from an old elite family. Her father is just a village headman, but she has the right bloodline. The then Maharaja of Baroda has married several times, doesn't have children, so he's going to try with one more wife. And this girl is chosen because she has the right bloodline. He has the money and status, just as in Mysore they wanted Rajput blood and they were happy to get a Rajput woman from a smaller setting. Similarly here, he had everything. He just needed a girl and a bride from the right kind of stock. So he gets this girl called Tanhibai. She's given a new name called Jamnabai. When she's 17 or 18, this Raja dies. She's still in her teens. She's not that much older, but she's pregnant. And so now this creates a political friction with her brother-in-law because the brother-in-law thinks that the Raja is dead, I should inherit the throne. But she's declared that she's pregnant, which means it's not clear who's going to inherit. If she gives birth to a male child, that child will inherit. Otherwise, it's this guy. The result is that he tries to poison her, etc. She starts cooking her own meals, sleeping with a dog chained to her bed, eventually moves to the house of the British agent in Baroda because she doesn't trust the palace servants, and she gives birth in the British resident's house. But when she gives birth, it's a girl. Now, this woman is still 18 years old. She doesn't give up. She doesn't say, okay, I've been defeated. Let my brother-in-law now become the king. I'm just going to retire into the harem and live the rest of my days in the harem. She doesn't do that. What she has is the jewelry and other goods that her late husband has given her. With all of that, she leaves Baroda state and moves to Pune. Sitting in Pune, she starts liquidating these assets that she has for money and paying people to complain against the Maharaja, paying people in the British resident's office to tell the British resident negative things about the Maharaja, pays for the press to criticize the Maharaja, and essentially mounts a campaign against her brother-in-law. He's also a bit of a rotten egg, so that makes life easier for her because many of these complaints come from legitimate grievances. But she just gives a push to that. She becomes a catalyst for negative publicity against her brother-in-law. And within 5 years, the brother-in-law is toppled. And this woman, now in her 20s, comes back to Baroda with her elephants and her goods, and she is now in the driving seat. Again, being a woman, it is lopsided. She can't rule because the British are like, no, you have to find a male heir to rule. So she and the British come to an understanding where the British don't want a grown man because then they also can't control the future of the state. But she also doesn't want a grown man because she wants someone she wants to control. So they get rid of the grown options that are available and they find a 12-year-old boy in Nasik, somewhere near Nasik, who's distantly related to the royal family, illiterate boy working on a farm, pick him up, put him on the throne. And she's calculating that because he's a teenager, she can shape him and eventually control him. The British are making the same calculation. The point is, she's got agency. She's a woman who has a mind of her own and she's got her own cards in play. So, born in a village, daughter of a village headman, essentially given away as a womb to a Maharaja because she has the right bloodline, etc. Fights a brother-in-law, gets rid of the brother-in-law, negotiates with the British, gets rid of other rivals to the throne, gets a small boy in power. When he grows up and becomes his own man and doesn't, eventually after a while, it's clear that he's not going to be manipulated by the Jamnabai. She tries to then, team up with the British again to put him in his place. That doesn't work. And finally, she eventually fades away. But even in the very fact that she made that much of an effort, it is clear that she isn't a helpless woman in a harem, unable to sort of do anything. With the resources available to her, she is trying to do things. Another example I often give is of the memoirs of this Nambudri Brahmin woman in Kerala who writes about how they weren't allowed access to newspapers, they weren't allowed access to education in a complete sense, they weren't allowed to read magazines or books or novels. And every month when they had their periods, they would have to isolate themselves in a certain room because they were considered impure. So that's where they would be. Now the thing is that in many ways, you could argue that that room is a representative of patriarchy and the worst things of patriarchy, that women have to be segregated over there when they have their periods. But the thing is, because that room was considered impure or whatever, that was the one room where men did not come and poke their noses.
Right.
So that is where they would read. That is where they would read these magazines. That is where they would read these novels. That is where they would consume all this contraband literature. So there is a subversion happening there. A room that is supposed to segregate you, you're seen as impure, etc., is being subverted by those same women. They don't have the power to come out and stand up to their uncles and fathers and say, no, we will not sit in this room. They still have to go and sit in the room, but they use that room to access education and to learn about things. So it's interesting how subversion is possible even when the odds are stacked against you. And a lot of women's stories are stories of subversion like this.
This is another pattern that you've explored, which is this nature of subversion and defiance to power. How do you operate within a context where there's politically someone else is more powerful, but how do you show defiance? And you've explored this in many, many forms. You often share story of your grandparents who had farm workers who were forced to call them my lordship, my lady, and then they ended up naming the cattle after the grandmom or the granddad called the cattle Kalyani or Madhavan. And that's their form of defiance. You shared a story of Colonel Munro when he took over the temples. The villagers spun up some stories about the gods fighting back. That's a way of just showing, okay, politically we're weaker, but somehow we would just want to gain some kind of power back or defy authority in some way. Shah Jahan growing a beard out to defy his father. And interestingly, in the Indian independence history, there's a fascinating dichotomy of defiance between Gandhi and Ambedkar, which went all the way down to the type of clothes they wore. Gandhi wore a loincloth because that was his idea of defiance, whereas Ambedkar wore a suit because that was his idea of defiance. So as you've studied subversion and defiance across all these different regions and people, is there one way that stands out to you? What is the most effective way of defying power and authority?
It isn't one thing, right? If you gave the Gandhi and Ambedkar example, from their respective prisms, both are valid. The thing is, Gandhi, from a nationalist prism, was he found that nationalism was in these like nice, neat little westernized, salons and libraries where people in suits were coming and talking about the big national questions. But he was like, no, we're never going to actually make a mass movement of it unless the people on the ground, the illiterate farmer and his wife, can connect with this whole idea. So he said, so long as we're dressed in suits, etc., that's not going to happen. We have to be able to even physically look like we are one with our people. For that reason, from a nationalist prism, it was important for him to wear the loincloth, because wearing the loincloth was a way of connecting with India's masses and getting the masses into the freedom struggle. From Ambedkar's prism, wearing the suit, he's looking at it from a caste angle. His ancestors only had the loincloth. They were not allowed to wear anything else. They really were prohibited from looking good, from wearing certain kinds of fabrics, wearing silk, gold, ornaments, whatever it was. So for him, wearing the suit was defiance, and wearing the suit was an act of assertion, because he's saying, even being a Dalit, look at me, I'm able to access education, I'm able to access respect. And both are true. From Gandhi's nationalist perspective, wearing the loincloth made a statement. From Ambedkar's caste-based perspective, wearing the suit was making a statement. Both are equally true in their respective contexts. So even defiance is very contextual. It is the question of who's at the subordinate level, who's defying what. All of this matters. Another example, with Gandhi is Gandhi wasn't a great fan of the railways or machines or whatever. But he subverted that whole British railway ecosystem.
By using it.
He'd get on the trains.
Yeah.
And the thing with him is, All he had to do was stick his head out at these platforms, because people would gather when they knew Gandhi was there, make a few statements, and the railway platform, which was in many ways a mark of British power and imperial agendas in India, got subverted into a nationalist platform. Simply by Gandhi being in those trains, he was able to turn it around and use it as a kind of nationalist platform for himself. So defiance happens in various ways. It happens in our own households. It happens with, you gave the example of these names, right? Back in the day, Dalits in Kerala were not allowed certain kinds of names. So you'd not find names like Lakshmi and Parvati, Sanskritized names among them. But it's quite fascinating that in my village, there's a lady whose name is Usha Khanna. She's a Malayali woman born in the 50s, I guess. And her name is Usha Khanna with the Khanna. It's part of her first name, okay. Usha Khanna. Because for the first time, Usha Khanna was, I think some kind of actress or something. For the first time, they were now free. After that caste-based feudal system had gone, a new order had come in. They were free to name their kids whatever they wanted. And the father was a fan of Usha Khanna. I don't know who Usha Khanna was. Maybe he just liked the name from somewhere. And he named his daughter Usha Khanna. So we still had this village lady in Kerala whose name is Usha Khanna. That is an act of defiance. Giving your children names that in an earlier time you would not be able to give them. So defiance operates constantly at levels like this. A young girl choosing to wear the clothes she wants to wear, choosing to cut her hair a certain way, queer people choosing to express themselves in certain ways. These are all forms of defiance oriented towards achieving certain goals in future. So when someone says, no, I'm not going to conform, I'm going to stand out, be an eyesore to you. You may define me as an eyesore, but I'm making a point. And through that, I'm paving the way for other people to also come forward and achieve whatever it is they want to achieve, etc. It happens at all levels. So defiance isn't purely about politics or colonialism, etc. It can happen in everyday life as well.
This connection with the everyday life, we started this conversation talking about what is the function, the role, or the use of history. And clearly there's a lot of relevance, which was not taught to me in high school. So this has been a fascinating connection. I guess it's, in a way, it's finding all these missing links where you're telling us the history, but also the relevance with everyday life. Abraham Irali used to say history is about life. So clearly, hopefully this conversation has been a good reflection of that. Before we wrap up, I have to ask you about your process as well, because it's pretty interesting. I think you have the routine of a professional athlete, but for a writer, which is something that people don't typically associate with. You spend a lot of time at the archives. In fact, more than half your life is probably spent at the archives. You've built your life around getting access to archives, picked a master's at King's College London so you could get access to the National Archives in the UK. Then when you worked for Shashi Tharoor, you wanted to get access to the National Archives in Delhi, Kerala State Archives, so that you started planning your work around it.
He was conveniently MP for Trivandrum, so that made access to the archives in Trivandrum.
Don't let him know that he was used.
No, he wrote me a letter. You need, see, in getting into Indian archives, still there's a lot of paperwork involved. Like, I remember going to the New York Public Library. I was there as a tourist, only for a couple of weeks or a few days. And I just walked in. I think I had to email in advance. Walked in, and in 5 minutes, I had my card and I was sitting at the desk over there. Whereas in Indian archives, there's still a lot of bureaucracy. So it always helps to get a recommendation or someone confirming that, no, this is a legitimate person doing legitimate research. It's quite unfortunate, but yeah, that's why it was helpful that he was there.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tharoor.
But sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
What I want to get to is, let's say I want to become a historian. I'm a budding historian. I've come to you today to understand what is the process, because if I want to be a cricketer, I know what the process is. I have to go train this much. This is the diet I need to have. What's the protocol I have to follow? But when we talk about a historian, is the only way to be a legitimate historian spend these many hours in the archives, collect notes, compile them, go back, revisit them? And if you do this for 12 hours a day for a month, you'll get a chapter at the end. Is that the only way to be a legitimate historian?
Your greatest quality that you need to cultivate to be a historian, or anybody who works in the social sciences, humanities, whatever, is critical thinking. As I said earlier in our conversation, the capacity to not see things or take things at face value, but to question the source itself. So you need to be able to look at a document and then ask certain questions, even as you cull the document from facts and information. You're also not taking it at face value. You're asking, what language is it written in? Who has written it? Why have they written it? At this particular time, for what audience? So if something is written in Sanskrit or Persian, it's intended for a certain kind of audience. Elite, trans-regional, etc., etc. If something is oral history and sung by the peasants of a certain region, that comes from a certain social milieu and a certain social bracket. And that has its own politics, it has its own texture and meaning, etc. You have to be able to understand that. So critical thinking is, I think, your greatest asset. If you can cultivate that, that is half the battle won. Then it's just a question of gaining diverse sources, gaining diverse perspectives, then it's something you can learn on your own. I mean, I've got a PhD in history, etc., but that was after I'd written multiple books. Now, I remember for the longest time, in today's world, it's quite unfortunate because so many barriers are being broken down. A lot of gatekeeping is falling by the wayside. So there isn't just one way to be a historian. This is a time when actually a lot of people have an interest in history. A lot of people on the ground are able to collect information that professional historians have missed in earlier times. I have a friend in Trivandrum, for example, who's the greatest source of local history over there. Every building, when it was created, who made it, the kind of material that was made, the ivory carvers of that city, etc. He's managed to gather all of this. His official training is as an architect, but personal passion has caused him to gather tremendous amounts of information. To me, he is definitely a person who qualifies as a historian. He doesn't have a PhD in history. He's not written a history book, as it were, but he's done a lot of the groundwork. It is up to him then to actually bring the critical lens, all of that, if he's ever doing a book out of it. But to me, that person also qualifies as somebody who works and legitimately works in history. So critical analysis, the capacity to do that, the aptitude and the passion to go out and ferret out information. There's a kind of lazy history that's done. You Google things, read 5 documents that are available online on archive.org, and you think, okay, I've got enough to do history. That's not the case. You really have to put yourself out there. There's a reason why books take years to sort of produce. And at the end of it, you still feel that you haven't done all your work. I still feel that. With each of my books, I feel, I could have done more. I could have spent more time on it. Humanly, it becomes impossible after a certain point. There are some scholars, for example, who'll work for 20 years on the same project and then produce one book. I don't think I have it in me to do that. I think.
But you spent 6, so why not?
I spent 6, but that is my upper limit. I don't think I could spend more than that. What I do now, therefore, is play to my strengths. So say I've worked a certain number of years on a project. With my book False Allies, or even Gods, Guns and Missionaries, it originated as a small project at my master's level, as a master's dissertation when I was 21 years old. But that's when the idea seeded itself. Then over the years, it kept playing on me. I kept building material, but I didn't feel like I was ready to do a book. I didn't feel I was there. By the time I got to that point, 8 years had passed, it was 2019. That's when I was like, okay, now I think I can do a book. In fact, 2017, I applied for a grant, didn't get it. So I was thinking about it. 19, I felt confident, okay, now I'll do a book. 20, I started writing, wrote half the manuscript, but I was like, no, something doesn't feel right. I need to go back. In the interim, I let this rest. You also have to sometimes sit with your thoughts. You also have to
let it marinate a bit.
You have to let it marinate you because you may not be ready at that particular juncture. So then haste doesn't work. So you let it sit for a while. That's when I finished False Allies. I finished my PhD, did all of those things. Then came back to the same old project that had been collecting material 8 years earlier, and then revisited and finished the project. You have to then figure out your own formula as to how
you have to be in a specific phase in life as well to write a particular book. Like you can't just go and explore any part of it. Let's say you want to write about a particular topic. Maybe there's a time in your life where you're the best suited to write that book.
Perhaps. For example, I think as I'm getting older, lots of things have changed. The way I approach topics, the way I write, all of that. For example, I have no desire now to write a 700-page book. I simply won't. It's not. I want to be able to condense it a lot more. With the first book, for example, I had chanced on what I thought was an amazing story, and I think it is an amazing story. I had chanced on archival material nobody had touched before. And the wealth of information was fascinating for me as someone who also loved history. So there is a yearning then to put everything you found into the book. Because you're like, oh my God, this is my one chance. I need to squeeze everything into one book. Now I don't do that. Now it's not as if I think that, everything has to be crammed into one book. Now it's more about the book being able to completely communicate what you want to communicate. But you don't need that yearning that everything has to be in there has reduced in great measure. So I think that's partly because of age. It's come from experience. It's come from now having done 5 books, etc., etc. 10 years down the line, I'll probably have a very different take again on history as well. I think Gods, Guns and Missionaries is a very serious book. It's serious reading. It demands a lot of the reader's attention, etc. The next book I do, I intend for it to be lighter and more playful and fun, because that's also for me to be able to keep doing that. Because I think I don't want to be one of those people who also sits and history has to be constantly read in a very serious way. No, I think you have to make history appealing for all kinds of people in different ways. It may not be everybody's cup of tea. Academics may not be interested in it, but I'm interested in it. I intend to therefore do it. So my next book will probably be a much lighter book, maybe a book of essays or something, where I will actively try to make it more fun and entertaining for the reader, because I want people to take an interest in history, for which I can't just bombard them with very serious, demanding books. I have to be able to also create different kinds of books for them, because deep inside, I'm also an author. As much as I'm someone who's invested in history and as a trained historian, I'm also an author. The narrative side of it, the storytelling side of it matters to me. Some people, funnily enough, use that as a bad thing. They're like, no, it's a bad thing. You should focus more on the analytical side of things, not so much on the storytelling, etc. Sorry, that doesn't interest me. There are other people who are doing just the analytical side. Good for them. I think it has its own value. But I derive value from being able to communicate that to a broader audience, which means being able to invest as much energy and time and commitment and sincerity to the storytelling side of things as well. So it's a constant process. Your mind is evolving. With age, you're evolving. No book is like the previous book. The language also evolves over a period of time. So yeah, there's a lot of factors in play. Hopefully, even at 50, I'm turning 36 this year, but hopefully 15 years down the line, I'll still be able to write interesting books that still interest people and not be jaded in doing the same old thing.
It's interesting the path you're taking, because in a way, it's the opposite of what a conventional historian takes. You started off by writing very big books, and even the language, the book starts as an antiquated language, then it becomes easier and easier as you move towards the modern times. There's this take on how language also evolved with the centuries.
That was deliberate, because the book begins in the Victorian period, and I was just like, So in the earlier chapters, I'll stick to a slightly Victorianized language, and then as we get to the 20th, late 20th, 1980s is where the story ends, the language becomes rather contemporary. Yeah, but I won't play tricks like that in future books. That was definitely my early 20s persona thinking, this is a good idea. I wouldn't do that.
This has been a fascinating insight, a deep dive into history. It's been an amazing masterclass. I wish you were my history teacher and I could have seen a lot of the relevance, and we could keep talking for hours. Hopefully we do a part 2 at some point. But for today, we have to start wrapping up. Before we go into the closing questions, I would love to know what
there are closing questions as a separate...
What is this? Shorter closing questions. Yeah. What do you think these masterpieces are? What do they look like?
This looks like a tower to me. Some kind of like construction, like a building. And this, frankly, I'm thinking of, I used to make things like this with Lego when I was 12 years old, and I used to imagine they were tanks. Like I used to create like these super weapons. I still have some drawings. Rubbish. It was like, there's no technology to it. It was just these like imaginary tanks and like weapons of mass destruction. And this reminds me of one of those. So this
exactly what I was building. In fact, you wanted to be an architect at some point, right? You used to put together layouts on
paintbrush. Yeah. I used to design houses. When I say design, I was 14 years old, so please let's not overstate it. I wasn't some kind of genius actually designing anything, but I used to enjoy planning houses and like creating designs like that.
Consider it art. It's a masterpiece. You can auction it if you like to. Closing questions for you. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly inspired you? I'm looking for recommendations.
Movies, etc. My favorite from my childhood. I recently rewatched it and I still loved it. I thought it was longer than I remembered it. Empire of the Sun, which is Christian Bale as a young boy. Because I watched it when I was about that age. And I just found that absolutely amazing. This, young boys sort of tribulations and being in a difficult place, etc. And I think in your adolescence, seeing that was, for me, it left a very deep impact. So I think that remains maybe my most memorable movie from childhood. Other shows I grew up watching was Jeeves and Wooster with Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry. Amazing, wonderful. Poirot, the Agatha Christie series, which ran for some 15 seasons, I think. Began in the early 90s and with David Suchet as the actor. I am now rewatching that on Sony Live. What other shows? There used to be this murder thing called Midsummer Murders. A lot of British shows for some reason.
Duchess of Duke Street.
Duchess of Duke Street. Wow, you've done your research.
The Good Life, all of them.
Yeah. These are all from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, which you got from the British Council.
We used to get it from the British Council. So those are my childhood memories of shows. In the recent past, shows I've enjoyed, there's one called Silo. Sci-fi post. It's like a dystopian world, etc. There was another one with an assassin called The Jackal. That I think season 1 is out. I like watching a lot of these thriller type shows. There was this one Australian show called Secret City, which was again about espionage and things like that. So I like shows of that.
Sensing a pattern.
Type. Yeah. I like watching political shows of that nature. But equally, I've watched completely frivolous shows. Vampire Diaries. There's another show where there were these vampire hunters. These two brothers. Were they vampire hunters or just demon hunters? I remember watching that for a bit. Because when I want to shut down, I watch silly time pass shows. So it's a whole spectrum. In terms of books, that's a tough one to answer because there are so many. I can't point at one book and say that this was life
My
altering.
last day on earth, and I can only read one book. Which is that one book I should read?
Good Lord, I'm not good with such questions. If it's your last day on earth and you're reading a book, I would frankly say read a work of fiction, a great work of fiction. I would not be reading non-fiction then. I would probably be reading some fiction.
Which one?
Good Lord, you're really putting me on the spot. What would I? Probably PG Woodhouse. Again, it's purely out of childhood nostalgia for me. If I'm dying and I know the world is ending, I want a laugh before I go.
Okay. World goes out with a laugh, not with a bang. If you could spend some time with one figure from history, who would it be?
Probably some tyrannical type. I have a fascination for villains.
Yeah.
So I like villainous.
Voldemort. House of Slytherin that you come
I like
from.
villainous characters. For the longest time, on Instagram, someone once asked me this, and I said it was Ivan the Terrible, simply because I love the name Ivan the Terrible.
Imagine.
What a wonderful.
What if he turns out to be a very polite, shy,
He probably
dignified
was.
person?
He probably was. A lot
Yeah.
of these titles, accrue much later in history and were not probably used in these characters' actual lifetime.
Akbar wasn't great.
I mean, he clearly thought he was, and definitely positioned himself. Very kings and powerful people like to do that. They like to position themselves as great.
Ivan the Terrible, I'll let him know. What would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
I don't want to be remembered. I just like at least some of the books I write to still be read maybe 100 years later. That, it doesn't happen to too many books. There are very few books that still remain on shelves as respected works 100 years later. So I'm hoping that maybe, at least in my full career, maybe if I write, say, 10 books, hopefully 2 or 3 of them will stand that test of time.
For now, at least they're standing the test of time. They are being read. Even your first book is being read. So
I mean, my first book still, gives me royalties and, a basic income. So I'm happy about that.
final question, and you probably know it's coming because you watched previous episodes. What is the meaning of life, Manu Pillai?
I don't know if life has meaning. It has whatever meaning we give it.
What do you give it?
I mean, just being useful, frankly, in general, and doing things that appeal to me. And being there for family and friends more than anything else. And writing books, as I said, that have something to say. I think beyond that, life doesn't really have that much meaning. You have to construct meaning for yourself. And for different people, it could be in different ways. I'm not the type who judges someone who derives meaning in life from having a swanky apartment and a big car. Good for them if that gives them meaning in life. Because as I said, beyond that, I don't think life has too much meaning. So if that's what makes you happy, good for you. For me, being able to communicate something, being able to tell stories, being able to investigate history, that gives me a sense of purpose and meaning. And I think that matters to me. For other people, it may be music. For other people, it may be films, whatever. There's no judgment with these things. I think these things are very personal. And for me, it is telling those stories and being able to sift through the past and find something new to say each time.
I hope you continue telling stories for years to come. Manu, if people wish to connect with you, find out more about you, read some of your books, what is the best way to find you, connect with you?
The social media I use the most is Instagram, and my handle there is vatcoconut. Don't ask, but
Your dad used to keep saying it.
yes,
Yeah.
and it's the handle I made when I was 21 years old. I haven't bothered to change it, and I'm sticking to it. So yeah, that's where people can find me.
What Coconut is the place? Manu.
Not what.
What Coconut?
The South Indian accent has to come across.
You're
What
asking too
coconut.
much from me.
You grew up in Dubai, I believe, so
That's right.
it's
I'm an
practically
ally.
an extension of Kerala.
I
so
went to Aaron High School, which is also an extension of Kerala. But Manu, thank you so much. Thank you for making this happen. It's been an honor for me.
thank you for having me, and I've enjoyed your previous episodes, so it's great to be on your show.
This is no time. If you liked what you just watched or listened to, then please consider subscribing on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This has been a 6-year-long experiment that is now potentially in its final year. We have constantly been told that people's attention spans are going down, that the type of content that they now want to watch are these viral clickbaity content, these 60-second reels or videos on TikTok, or gossip over a montage of Subway Surfer because that hacks the algorithm. But I believe in my heart of hearts, that's not what the people want. I'm constantly surrounded by people who crave conversations about philosophy, psychology, quantum physics, or even history. In a way, it's the algorithm that's pushing us in a direction that we don't want to go. So this has been a losing battle, honestly. It's a fight against the algorithm. And I've constantly been losing. So I've stopped trying and hack it, create these AI-generated thumbnails or these clickbait titles or ask questions that I know will go viral or edit videos in a certain way with all these effects. I've stopped trying to do that. So the only way you can actually ensure this project survives and I can continue having conversations that I think are of value is by supporting it directly. Consider making a donation on Patreon. You can join as a YouTube member for less than $1 a month, and YouTube members get early access to all videos. If not through financial channels, I do consider sharing these episodes. Your shares are gold dust for a show of this nature. It really helps. It really helps me push past the barriers set by the algorithm. If not shares, then please consider following this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally, or leave your likes and comments and all forms of other engagement.